Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Samantha Mirabal with Milka's application team. We're doing our Design Shop Talk again today. See what questions you might have. I got a handful of questions sent in ahead of time. If you have questions while we're live, type them in on the chat and I will, if you see me looking off to another monitor, that's what I'm doing. I've got a secondary monitor over here where I can keep the platforms up and see what questions come in. So let me just make sure we are active on both of them. Yep, YouTube is good, and so is Facebook. So, all right, thank you for joining. I'll start on the questions that were sent in ahead of time, and then I'll be checking the live feed to see what else we can talk about. All right, after receiving a file from a digitizer, is it possible to separate different elements in DesignShop? So, yes, it is possible. Separating expanded files is not what I would call a fun activity. Can you do it? Absolutely. Is it something I personally enjoy? No. Some people do, but I don't like doing it. But yes, you can do it. So let's go open a file. I'm going to go open an expanded. Oops, let's open that one that's expanded. It's the same thing, just not an OFM. All right. So this is an expanded file type. So when you send, let's say you send some file off to be digitized, it comes back and you open it up and you notice that there's these things. They say expanded, right? And unlike if I open up the one that was digitized in DesignShop, you'll notice these say walk normal, you know, all the different elements. And it shows you how the file was created element by element. This native format is easier to make changes to, right? Because you have the wireframe information, you have all the stitches, the densities, everything is assigned to those shapes. Whereas if I go over to this expanded type, it's an expanded file is essentially a list of coordinates of where all the needle penetrations are, so where each of the stitches are going to be made, trims, and depending on the file type, it saves some color information. Expanded EXPs and DSTs don't save color information, which is why it defaults to this kind of bizarre color scheme. All right, so let's say we want to separate each of these pairs to be a different color, or we just need to separate them for whatever reason. I'm going to turn off the others so we're looking at one thing at a time. So yes, you can convert to wireframe. That's one option. When you convert to wireframe, it guesses at the shapes, so you'll get a lot of interesting things. What I like to do is if I'm just trying to separate stuff, rather than converting over, I did something already. All right, so select what you want to modify. Up here is an expanded editing mode. When I turn that on, and now I'm going to disable the 3D. So when you do that, you see all these little X's. Those are the needle penetrations. Those are the stitches. So if I want to split it, I'm going to click on one of those. So you see it puts a propeller by it. That stitch is selected. All right, I can drag that stitch around. Is that what I want to do here? No. So I'm going to undo that, but that's just to show you can do expanded editing one stitch at a time if you're so inclined. Here, I just want to insert a trim. So now I've got this one up here and these three down here. So I can take that one, make it a green apple or a green pear. All right, so what about these down here? Again, I can do the same thing. I can turn on expanded editing mode. Oh, helps if I select it first, huh? So there we go. Select it, turn on the expanded editing mode, decide where I want it to split apart, separate it. And let's make those guys orange. So maybe I want that one to be red. For these, again, I'm going to click the element, go into expanded editing mode so I can see the stitches, click on one, insert a trim, and now I can make that pair purple. You know, really realistic colors go in here. All right. Okay, so I split those apart. Now if I want to turn it all back on, so now I have those all as unique elements, unique colors, and I can change them around. So that's one thing. Now, what was the original question? I'm going to make sure I'm not. Yeah, is it possible to separate elements in DS? So yes, we just separated the elements. It really takes looking at them to try to decide where you want to separate it, right? So you've got to think about that. If I want to go separate these leaves, for instance, it becomes a lot more complex. So or a lot more interesting to figure out, right? So those I would have to, particularly when they're overlapping like this, I might have to go through and figure out where the stitch is underneath one of these to take these two leaves out of it, right? So you've got to kind of work your way through it by stitches. Now, if you are trying to navigate to find a stitch, don't forget you've got the stitch tab down here, right? So let's say I come over here, I go into expanded editing mode, and I'm not sure if that's the stitch I want to split at. I can come over into this thing and walk through and see what it's doing. So you can see that would work. It's coming up to sew those two leaves right there, right? So you can walk your way through stitch by stitch to see what's happening. So that's where it's doing those. So if I want to split just that leaf off, maybe there's where I want to insert a trim. Okay, and let's see what changed. Okay, so that did part of it, but now I've got to go actually find the other side of that, right? So if I go to the stitch tab, I can now work my way down and go, all right, where do I want to stop it? So now it's going to the other leaf, so I'm going to trim it there. So there it is. So now I have a blue leaf. So yes, you can absolutely walk your way through designs and change elements doing expanded. So if you change to a wireframe edit, how can we insert trims without distorting the digitized file? That one I don't understand. Inserting a trim, you just insert a trim. Same way I did there. And inserting trims isn't going to distort anything, right? So if I take this thing and I go operations, convert to wireframe, and then let's say I want those guys to be orange, or maybe I want to not have that jump stitch there. I can delete it. Yeah, where's the other jump stitch? There. So it's a walk. You know, you can modify it any way you want, and I'm not quite sure I understand that second question. Insert a trim without distorting it. It shouldn't distort it. Another question we had was, how do I know what settings to adjust for tension pull? Okay, so I assume you mean the shortening of the narrowing up of columns as it's sewing, right? So I'm not sure if you're asking about the digitized or on the machine. So if the thread's running too tight on your machine, that means you need to up your active feed, right? Because the lower the number on your active feed setting, the tighter that thread's going to pull. The tighter the thread is. If you increase it, it gets looser. Now, does that just mean make it, big number? No, because then you're going to be looping or it's not going to sew right. So there's a balance in there. Is it super precise? I don't find it to be super precise, but if you want it to be, a little bit looser when sewing, you can always up your active feed and see if that gives you the look you're going. Now, if you're talking about the effect of all embroidery is going to narrow up some because of pull, when, it makes sense to me when I think about it, because when you make a stitch, right, it's going to go grab the bobbin thread, the top thread's going to come through the hole. So now you got a piece of thread hanging out, in the needle and in the fabric tied. Now the machine's going to pull this way. Well, what's going to happen to that thread? It's going to pull on the hole that was just made by the thread, right? So that stitch is going to move, that way. Now it's going to come over here and make a stitch. And when it goes to the other side, that hole is going to move in. So your net effect is your column is going to narrow up, okay? So if you're looking at that is going to be pull compensation, right? So since I waved my hands in the air rather than on the screen, let's review what I just said, right? So I'll put this in 3D, and I'm going to make the density bigger just to narrow it up so you can see the stitches a little bit better. Turn off auto, 10. I just want it, and I'm going to turn that off so it's not distracting from what we're looking at here. Okay. So when it makes this stitch here, now it's going to move this way. So the hole that the thread is it's going to want to come in this way. When it makes this stitch, and now the machine is moving this way, that hole is going to want to go this way. So that's what I mean. Your columns are going to narrow up. All right. So knowing things narrow, what do you want to do about that? We want to overstitch it, make it wider, so that when it narrows up, you're compensating for that. So that's called pole compensation. So if I go into the properties here and go under compensation, you've got pole comp by percent. That's a multiplication. Okay, that's what that's doing. It's looking at the length of the stitch and how much percent you tell it, that's how much it's going to overstitch by. I prefer offset strongly. I'm going to make this a really big number. Should you do this? No. Just to show you. When I make that 10, see what happens? It makes it bolder. It makes it wider. It's overstitching by a large amount. So when it narrows up, hopefully that works for you. Now, should you do 10? No. I would... 1 to 3 points is usually plenty. I'll be honest, I usually put 2 points on most things just because I'd rather overdo it a little bit. Now there is a point where it gets silly, right? So if you find yourself making it wider and wider and wider using pole compensation, it's probably better just to fix your design so it's digitized to be wider, because around curves and other things, if you keep on relying on pole offset, it's not going to look as clean as if you digitized it correctly. Okay, so keep that in mind. 1 to 3 points is usually plenty. I would recommend at least putting 1 point on pretty much anything. That's my tidbit. All right, so that's how do you know how much to apply? It's, experience, right? How well are you stabilizing it? Are you using appropriate stabilizers? Is your machine the act feed setting right? But 1 to 3 points is usually plenty. Okay. How much of an overlap do you use for outlines to a fill? So there's no spacing. I usually go for the midline personally, but I've been told, well, all right, for an outline, it really depends on how wide your fill that you're trying to put an outline around is, right? So the wider something is, a fill area, the more it's going to narrow up, okay? So those, I usually just go straight to the midline and call it done. Mainly because I'm just a little conservative that way. So what I mean by that is if I have a shape, okay, so I've got a shape, I'm going to add a single line center, that's an outline, and I'm going to add it. And there we go. So how much of an overlap? Right now it defaults to midline because I did a single line center. It does half the width of the stitch this way, half that way. So I think the rule of thumb is anywhere from 7 to 10 points overlap is all you need. I usually just go straight for the midline. So in this case, that does happen to be 10. If this were 40, then my overlap would be 20. And I'm okay with that. That's just how I like to do things. Okay. All right, so what other questions do we have? I don't see any typed in today. I'm a quiet crowd. So those were actually the only questions I had sent in ahead of time. So those who are online, if you've got any questions, type them in. I'll wait a few minutes before I call it a day, just to see if there's anything else you guys want to talk about. But yeah, I mean, pole compensation, some of it, this. So if I've got a really large fill area, you're going to want more overlap, and you're going to want to have pole compensation in the direction it's sewing more. Or making sure you have a good underlay. That's another technique to making sure it doesn't move around much, right? So doing good digitizing practice is always helpful for minimizing the amount that things can move and shift so your outlines don't end up with gaps. Okay. All right. So what else do we have? Any others? We got an article on pole compensation there for you, so take a look at that in the comments or in the chat. My kids have been lecturing me. Apparently I'm not supposed to call it comments. I'm supposed to talk to the chat like, hi chat. I don't get it. I'm showing my age. Can you tell? All right. What other questions do we have? Oh, hold on for a moment or two more since we had some more people join. Anyway, all right. Well, those were all the questions I had sent in for this week. We try to do these on a every week basis. So if you have questions, you'll see this little picture up on various Facebook groups, Melka Facebook groups. When you see that, that's where I'm soliciting for questions. So if you've got them, fill them in. You can always email the applications team. You can send them in ahead of time. But anytime you see that, type in your questions. That's where I get them for ahead of time. It's particularly if I need to prep something. It's helpful if I have them ahead of time. Digitizing on the fly can be slow and boring to watch. So, that's all I had for the day. I guess I will talk to you guys next week. Next week I'm aiming for Thursday. And we are rapidly approaching the end of the school year. Thank goodness. I'm over it. I'm ready for the summer. But we've got graduation parties and all sorts of nonsense going on for all my children's friends. A stepping up party. All right. Well, I will talk to you guys next week. You guys have a fantastic weekend. And next week I'm aiming for Thursday. So I'll see you then. Bye, everyone.